Advocates of the Quran will argue that everybody is treated the same in the Quran. But this leads me to discuss what I have often found to be a discrepancy between the stated ideals of the Quran on the one hand and their exposition on the other, between the general and the specific, between the principles and their details. The Quran no doubt speaks of all the ideals that modern societies espouse. It speaks of compassion, kindness, charity, social justice, benevolence. But how does it actually define these? In other words, is social justice really social justice the way it is described in the Quran? Let me explain my point further by providing an example of an oft-quoted verse of the Quran. It states that there is no compulsion in religion. But then throughout the rest of the Quran, God demands total submission, warning mankind of an everlasting hellfire if there is no compliance. This principle is therefore certainly not relevant to our modern sensibilities, where choices are to be regarded as genuine if and only if they are exercised freely, without duress, without hell as a sword of Damocles hanging over people's heads. A secular perspective sees it as vital to acknowledge that societies never remain static. Indeed, they are constantly evolving. From this perspective alone, any system of belief that has a built-in stasis, such as that embodied in the Quran, cannot be relevant to our times. Orthodox Muslims regard the laws and injunctions of the Quran as being relevant for all times, but even a cursory examination of the antecedents of these injunctions will clearly demonstrate that these were meant to be very time-specific. I will only briefly mention a few in order to prove my point. But before I do that, I need to tell you that my approach to the Quran is the same as it is towards other scripture. Most advanced societies acknowledge that laws must be based on the needs of evolving and constantly changing societies. Even countries such as the United States, that are sometimes avowedly religious, have recognized the need to separate politics from religion. It is these societies that have made social progress. Social progress being measured by the extent to which the minorities and women have been lifted out of their state of marginalization. These societies have been able to evolve an attitude towards religion and its literature that is respectful, yet mindful of the consideration that laws must address the needs of contemporary societies. For example, does the Quranic injunction enjoining women to wait 4 months before remarrying after the passing of their husbands have relevance for modern times? This provision was put in place for 7th century Bedouins to be able to make determinations of paternity and lineage in the absence of medical tests. But now, with all the medical advances that enable such determinations through a simple test, I question the relevance of such a provision to our modern circumstances. Take the issue of inheritance rights. I know it's been discussed before, but while the reforms introduced by the Quran acknowledge some inheritance rights to women and were hence laudatory for the time, can they be deemed fair now, when women are sometimes the sole breadwinners for their families? What about slavery? Do our modern sensibilities not recognize slavery as morally repugnant? Yet it has received some affirmation in the Quran when it says, slaves are to be treated kindly. The people who promote the idea of the eternal relevance of the Quran feel compelled to do so because of its purported divine origin. However, I am at the very least familiar with one such, and I quote, divinely inspired injunction that was very much in place before the existence of the Quran. I am referring to the punishment of severing the hands of thieves for the crime of theft. This too has been discussed before, but I have a different twist to it. Now, this was a punishment in vogue in 7th century Arabia that the Quran simply retained. It has its origin in tribal and customary law rather than in a supposed divine revelation. My contention here is supported by the fact that most Sunni Muslims acknowledge this to be the case. According to the Sunni view, and most Muslims subscribe to the Sunni view, the Quran in fact did retain many of the customs and traditions of pre-Islamic Arabia. These were mostly tribal laws and customs tailored to the needs of 7th century societies. They may have worked very well for those societies, but is the cutting of hands for theft relevant now, when we have prisons and other correctional facilities. It is these same injunctions of a customary nature that are now accepted unquestioningly as divine writ, whereas their origin can be clearly linked to customs and tradition. Furthermore, the faithful believe these cannot and must not be amended, as they regard them as divine and therefore perfect. Their relevance to modern times, therefore, must be contrived through specious arguments and rationalizations that seek to justify the unjustifiable, such as polygamy and concubinage. Since these laws cannot be changed according to the die-hard orthodoxy, it is the societies that must revert to being the way they were, so as to conform to these medieval archaic laws for the relevance to be established. But is such a scenario achievable or even desirable? There is yet another school of thought within Islam which seeks to establish the Quran's relevance, and we have seen some representation of that in the previous speakers. And no offense to you. The Quran's relevance needs to be established to contemporary sensibilities through newer interpretations. The objective is to align the Quran to modern notions of gender equity, civility, tolerance, and humanity. This constitutes the progressive discourse within Islam. There seems to be a growing body of literature which attempts to seek solutions to long-standing issues through such reinterpretation, and Dr. Lali Bakhtiar, by the way, her interpretations of verse 434 is one example. In my opinion, however, these interpretations are often forced, and I disagree with Dr. Lali Bakhtiar as well. She's a friend of mine, but I disagree with her. They are unfounded in their lack of fidelity to the letter and spirit of the Quran, while at the same time being intellectually devoid of the rigors of logical scrutiny, as they tend to be highly subjective. A modernist approach, for example, would seek to reconcile religion with science, but is there truly a basis for such an interpretation, other than the ramblings of an overactive imagination? I am not indicting the Quran. The Quran, like other holy books, contains words of wisdom and axiomatic truths. And for its time, the Quran sought to improve the conditions of the downtrodden. But once again I ask, are these time-honored truths uniquely Quranic? Aren't truthfulness, honesty, trustworthiness, selflessness virtues that are universally acknowledged as worthy? Indeed they are. These time-tested moral principles can and very often are arrived at with or without scripture. I have already alluded to a New Age theology within the Judeo-Christian tradition, which approaches the Bible critically, treating it as a book of wisdom and folklore, perhaps divine, but still one that is subject to scrutiny. There is no comparable approach towards the Quran among the adherents of Islam. The result is the Quran and all that it contains is accepted without question, rendering the Muslim psyche totally resistant to change. But change is paramount. We need to see past each other's religious, cultural, ethnic, and social differences. That is the way of the future and the way to a better world. Scripture, with all its trenchant hierarchy, does not allow for such humanitarian principles to flourish. Societies are now striving to be more pluralistic, more humane, less hierarchical, less dictatorial in order to accommodate the happiness of the greatest number of human beings. For these ends to be achieved, a certain evolution of thought must be permitted, one that is free to identify and challenge injustices wherever they occur, even if it's in Scripture. For these ends to... It is only when societies encourage new visions of a better world that these visions have any hopes at all of ever materializing. Scripture, and the Quran is no exception, contains injunctions that discourage a free exploration of ideas. But it is new visions that often enable us to become better human beings, living in peace and harmony in a better world, because it is a freer and more tolerant world.